August 8th, minutes past 1 in the morning. The air above Savo Island smells of salt and cordite. The Solomon Sea is black and absolute, the kind of darkness that swallows distance, erases direction, and turns the surface of the water into a moving mirror of nothing. There are no stars visible. A thin equatorial squall has blurred the horizon into a gray smear somewhere far to the south. Somewhere in that blackness, Allied warships are riding at anchor, heavy cruisers and their escorts, standing watch over the transports that had brought United States Marines to Guadalcanal the day before. The sailors aboard those cruisers believe they are ready. They have radar. They have been told that the new American technology gives them eyes in the dark that no enemy can match. They are wrong, and before the sun rises, they will know it. Out of that same darkness, moving at nearly 30 knots, with every light extinguished, comes Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer. His lookouts, trained over years in the art of nocturnal observation, their eyes conditioned through months of deliberate regimen, shielded from bright light, fitted with massive 15-centimeter naval binoculars that gathered ambient light the way a net gathers water, have already seen the Allied ships. They saw them first. They have always seen the enemy first. That is the doctrine. That is the philosophy. That is the pride. What followed in the next 32 minutes was the worst defeat suffered by the United States Navy in a fair fight on the open sea. For Allied heavy cruisers, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra were sent to the bottom of what the world would soon call Ironbottom Sound. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died. Mikawa's force retired virtually undamaged into the western darkness, leaving behind burning ships and a silence so complete it felt like judgment. American radar had been present that night. It had not saved a single ship. The lesson the Imperial Japanese Navy took from Savo Island was not caution. It was confirmation. To understand what that confirmation meant, one must understand what the Japanese Navy believed about itself and about its enemy, and what it had spent 2 decades building that belief upon. Long before the Pacific War began, Japanese naval planners had accepted a hard arithmetic. The United States possessed a larger industrial base, a larger population, and the capacity to build more ships than Japan could ever hope to match in a sustained conflict. The solution, as conceived in the doctrine of the Kantai-Kessen, the Great Decisive Battle, was not to fight the American fleet on equal terms. It was to erode it, night by night, through precision violence. The IJN would use the darkness as a weapon. It would train its men to become creatures of the night, and it would arm those men with instruments the Americans had no answer for. The instrument of choice was the Type 93 torpedo. Japanese engineers had developed it, through the 1930s, into something the rest of the world's navies could not yet conceive of, propelled by pure oxygen rather than compressed air. It left almost no wake, no white trail cutting through the black water to warn a ship of what was coming. It carried a warhead of nearly 1,100 pounds of explosive, almost twice the payload of contemporary American torpedoes. It could travel 49 knots for 22 kilometers, or 42 knots for 32 kilometers, ranges so far beyond what American naval planners imagined possible that, for years, they refused to accept the evidence of their own wrecked ships. They called it the Long Lance, and they were right to fear it. Beside the Long Lance stood the IJN's lookouts. The Imperial Navy had built a culture around the human eye. Sailors with demonstrated superiority in night vision were culled from the general pool and given years of specialized training. They were issued binoculars of 12, 15, and 18 centimeters, instruments of precision ground in Japanese. Optical factories, whose quality was recognized as world-class. These men could detect a ship at 8,000 yards in near total darkness. They protected their eyes religiously, before an anticipated night action. All illuminating equipment was extinguished, every bright instrument covered. When the guns were fired, lookouts turned their heads. The flash of gunfire was an enemy of the eye, and the eye was their weapon. In this world, radar was not a wonder. It was, in the Japanese professional view, a crutch for a nation that lacked the discipline to train its men properly. American and British reliance on electronic detection was read as evidence of weakness, of a culture that preferred to trust machines over men, convenience over mastery, technology over spirit. Across the wardrooms of IJN destroyer squadrons throughout 1941 and into 1942, a professional contempt for the concept of radar-guided night combat had calcified into something close to doctrine. The Americans had their glowing screens. The Japanese had something older and, they believed, more reliable: the trained eye, the swift torpedo, and the darkness as an ally. Savo Island confirmed that belief so powerfully that it took something close to destruction to dislodge it. In the months that followed, the waters around Guadalcanal became the arena in which this contest between 2 philosophies of night combat would be fought out. The channel between Guadalcanal and the island chain to the northwest, called the Slot by Allied sailors, became one of the most contested waterways in naval history. Down through it, night after night, ran the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyers loaded with troops and supply drums, racing at 30 knots through the darkness to land reinforcements on Guadalcanal and return before American air power could find them at dawn. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, intensely professional officer who had earned the respect even of his enemies, commanded these runs with a cold precision that left American naval planners in a state of sustained frustration. The Americans had SG radar by now, developed and first deployed aboard the heavy cruiser USS Augusta in April 1942. The SG was a genuine technological achievement. The Navy's first surface search radar, operating in the S-band microwave frequencies, a rotating antenna no larger than a kitchen table, delivered returns onto a planned position indicator scope, a circular glowing screen on which a sweeping line of green light traced the positions of every surface. Contact within 22 nautical miles. For a generation that had learned to find ships through telescopes and binoculars, the PPI scope was something close to a miracle. A cold, green, luminous eye that never slept, never blinked, never shielded itself from a muzzle flash. It could see in any direction simultaneously. It did not need stars. On the night of October 11, 1942, at Cape Esp, American Rear Admiral Norman Scott used SG radar to cross the T on a Japanese force, attempting to land reinforcements and supplies. The cruiser Furutaka was sunk. The destroyer Fubuki disappeared in a storm of American shellfire. For the first time, radar had given the Americans the first contact, the precious advantage of knowing before being known. Japanese Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, commanding the incoming force, was struck by shellfire on his own bridge and mortally wounded. He died reportedly believing he had been fired upon by his own ships. That is what the radar had done. It had made the Americans invisible. It had wrapped them in the night the Japanese believed they owned. But the Japanese were not finished. They were not close to finished. On the night of November 30th, 1942, Tanaka led 8 destroyers down the slot with drums of rice and ammunition destined for the starving Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. Waiting for him was an American force of 5 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers, several of them equipped with SG radar. The Americans detected Tanaka's force first. They opened fire first. For several minutes, it appeared the battle would go entirely the Americans' way. Then the Long Lance arrived. Tanaka's destroyers, caught in the sudden glare of American searchlights and star shells and receiving the first salvos from radar-guided guns, responded with a reflex so practiced it required no thought. They dropped their supply drums and launched their Type 93 torpedoes in spreads, calculated for the positions of the American ships. Those torpedoes traveled through the dark water for minutes, running deep, running quiet, running at 49 knots, while Tanaka's outnumbered ships turned and retreated. The Americans, believing they had surprised and scattered the enemy, continued to maneuver. They did not know what was already in the water, already finding them. The torpedo that hit USS Northampton opened her like a tin, and she sank. 3 other cruisers were badly damaged. Tanaka lost 1 destroyer to gunfire, but sank an American cruiser and crippled 3 others with a weapon the radar could not track and the eye could not see until the column of water rose. Above the Gulf, the Americans lost over 400 men. The Battle of Tassafaronga, as it was named, became a humiliation studied in American naval war colleges for years afterward. It had demonstrated that the SG radar, while extraordinary, was not enough by itself. The Americans had the eyes, the glowing green eye of the PPI scope, but they had not yet learned how to use them. The habit of the old night battle playbook: illuminate with star shells, announce your radar contact before firing, form cruiser line, engage with guns was throwing away the one thing radar gave them: invisibility. By firing star shells and opening up with heavy cruiser batteries the moment they detected Tanaka on their scopes, the Americans had made themselves visible to the Long Lance before the torpedoes were yet in the water. They had traded the gift of anonymity for the comfort of the old familiar procedure, in the naval corridors of Tokyo and Truk. The conclusion was drawn with something approaching satisfaction. American radar was real, but it was being operated by men who did not understand night combat. Men who lit up the sky to find an enemy who was already aiming at the light. The glowing green eye, in these assessments, was a device without a doctrine. Japan would go on winning the night. For the next several months, through the battles of Guadalcanal's naval campaign, Kolombangara in July 1943, where Long Lance torpedoes badly damaged 3 Allied cruisers despite radar detection, the Japanese assessment seemed well-founded. In the slot, the night still belonged to the men with the big binoculars and the oxygen-fueled torpedoes. The Americans were learning, but they were learning expensively, paying in ships and men for each lesson. Then came August 6, 1943, and Vella Gulf. Commander Moosbrugger brought 6 destroyers into the Vella Gulf that evening, and he carried with him a doctrine that had been quietly rewritten in the shadow of every previous defeat. Moosbrugger had studied what Tanaka had done to the American cruisers at Tassafaronga. He understood, with the cold clarity of an officer who had watched good men die for tactical errors, exactly what the Americans had been doing wrong. The lesson was not that radar was insufficient. The lesson was that they had been broadcasting their possession of it, turning on the lights before they fired, giving the Long Lance time to reach them. The correction was not technological. It was conceptual. It was silence. Moosbrugger divided his 6 destroyers into 2 divisions. Division 1, led by himself, would approach on a silent intercept course using SG radar to track the incoming Japanese force. No star shells, no illumination, no announcement of contact. Division 2 would take a diverging course to cut off retreat, and no one, no officer, no enlisted man, no radar operator at his glowing green scope, would fire a single round or drop a single star shell until the torpedoes were already in the water. The Long Lance had been a lesson. Moosbrugger had learned it completely. The Japanese force that entered Vella Gulf on the night of August 6th consisted of 4 destroyers under Commander Kahu, the Arashi, the Kawakaze, and the Shigure, loaded with supply drums for the garrison on Colombang. Their upper decks heavy with rice and ammunition. Their crews experienced and disciplined. The Japanese lookouts, sweeping the darkness ahead with their 15-centimeter glasses, saw nothing. The SG radar aboard Moosbrugger's lead destroyer, USS Dunlap, had been painting their positions for 18 minutes. Moosbrugger let them come to within 6,000 yards. Then, in coordinated silence, his 3 lead destroyers fired 24 torpedoes in a spread, so precisely calculated that the geometry of the kill zone overlapped with every possible evasive course. The Japanese ships might take not 1 gun fired. Not 1 star shell rose. The Solomon Sea remained absolutely dark. The Hagikaze died first. She simply erupted a column of fire and fractured steel that rose hundreds of feet into the air and illuminated for a few terrible seconds the entire surface of the Gulf. The Arashi was struck moments later and broke apart. The Kawakaze caught a torpedo near her forward magazine and vanished in a detonation, so violent that sailors on Moosbrugger's bridge felt the concussion in their chests before the sound reached them. 3 destroyers were gone in under 4 minutes. The 4th, Shigure, turned at flank speed through the chaos and ran, the sole survivor of a force that had never seen the men who killed it. Of the 1,200 sailors aboard those 3 ships, fewer than 40 survived. Moosbrugger lost not 1 man. Not 1 ship. The Battle of Vella Gulf was not simply a tactical victory. It was the moment the night changed ownership. For the first time since the war in the Solomons had begun, a Japanese commander's force had been destroyed without having had the opportunity to respond, to launch, to maneuver, to bring the long lance to bear, the weapon that had defined the IJN's entire philosophy of nocturnal combat, the instrument that had made Tassafaronga a humiliation, Savo Island a massacre, Kalimbangara a bitter lesson, had never left its tubes. The Americans had removed the precondition of its effectiveness. They had done it by committing to total silence. By trusting the radar? Absolutely. And by firing first with a weapon the Japanese had always used as their own signature, the torpedo in the dark. The intelligence, reports that reached Combined Fleet headquarters in the days following Vella Gulf were read with something more than concern. They were read with the beginning of a recognition that the IJN's professional culture had resisted for nearly 2 years. The Americans were no longer the men who didn't understand the night. They were becoming something else, a force that understood the night through different eyes, that moved through darkness by instruments and discipline rather than by trained vision alone. And that had quietly, expansively, systematically absorbed every lesson the Japanese had taught them. The recognition came too late to reverse but not too late to be felt. Captain Arleigh Burke, who had earned the informal title 31 Not Burke for his aggressive use of destroyer, speed and radar in the Solomons, understood the new calculus precisely. We do not need to see them. He would write in a tactical report summarizing the methods developed through late 1943. We need to know where they are. The radar tells us where they are. The torpedo does the rest. The statement was, in its way, the philosophical opposite of everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had built its night doctrine upon. The Americans had not rejected human skill. They had reframed it. The skill was now in reading the green scope, in understanding the geometry of a torpedo spread, in having the discipline to hold fire until the mathematics of destruction were already in motion. In November 1943, Burke took his destroyer squadron into the waters around Cape St. George and met a Japanese reinforcement run with the same geometry that Moosbrugger had used at Vella Gulf. He sank 3 destroyers without loss. The dispatches from his after-action report contained no celebration. They contained geometry, bearing angles, torpedo release points, estimated target speeds. The poetry of night combat, so beloved of IJN culture, had been replaced by trigonometry. Trigonometry, it turned out, did not miss. There is a detail that appears in the testimony of Japanese destroyer captains who survived the Solomons campaign, recorded after the war in the interrogation transcripts compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Several of these men who had served with Tanaka, who had run the Tokyo Express through the slot in the brutal middle months of the campaign, described the same experience of those later battles in terms that were almost identical in their quality of surprise. They had expected to be seen. They had accepted that the Americans could detect their ships at range. What they had not accepted, because it ran so deeply against the doctrine they had been trained in, was that the Americans would fire before announcing themselves, would fire without illumination, would choose to remain anonymous in the darkness until the moment when announcement was no longer necessary because the damage was already done. One IJN destroyer commander, whose name appears in the Strategic Bombing Survey records only as a collective voice among many, put it with a directness that deserves preservation. The Americans, he said, had learned to fight like the sea itself. The sea does not warn you. It does not illuminate itself before it strikes. It is simply already there, and then it is upon you, and then you are in it. The PPI scope, that cold, circular, greenlit instrument that had sat largely unused and misunderstood in American combat information centers through the disasters of 1942, had become, by 1944, something that Japanese professional culture had never anticipated it becoming, not just a tool, but a weapon. And the difference between those two categories, in naval combat, is the difference between possessing something and being transformed by it. Consider what the scope was, at its core. It was a machine that reduced the infinite complexity of the night ocean, the rolling swells, the atmospheric interference, the sensory labyrinth that Japanese lookout doctrine had spent decades learning to navigate by the trained human eye to a single luminous point on a circular green field. Each point of light on that field was a ship. It told you its bearing, its range, its speed, its course. It told you these things continuously, without fatigue, without the distraction of a gun flash or a wave crest. It told you where the torpedoes needed to go before the enemy knew you existed. In the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the great 15-centimeter binoculars had been a symbol. They were issued to the best men, the ones selected for their vision, their discipline, their ability to see what others could not. They were maintained with the same reverence a craftsman brings to a fine instrument. They represented the superiority of the trained Japanese eye over the mechanical dependency of Western navies, passed down from senior lookout to junior. They were the physical expression of a doctrine, the conviction that human mastery, built through years of deliberate cultivation, could be made sharper than any machine. The PPI scope was the opposite kind of symbol. It had been manufactured in a factory. It had been installed by a navy that trusted industry to solve problems that doctrine and training had failed to solve. It was not beautiful. It hummed, faintly, in the darkness of the Combat Information Center, and it cast its green light onto the faces of 20-year-old sailors from Ohio, and Georgia, and California who had been operating it for months rather than years. It did not care whether the man looking at it had perfect vision or ordinary vision. It showed what it showed to everyone equally. That democratic quality, the indifference of the machine to the refinement of the individual, was precisely what Japanese naval doctrine had defined itself against. And it was precisely that quality that made it, in the end, decisive, because the binoculars could only ever produce as many sets of trained eyes as the years of training could sustain. The PPI scope could be replicated in any shipyard in any number. By 19, the United States had installed surface search radar on every destroyer, every cruiser, every capital ship in the Pacific Fleet. The knowledge of how to use it, the doctrine that Moosbrugger had applied at Vella Gulf, that Burke had refined at Cape St. George, was codified and distributed throughout the fleet with the same industrial efficiency that had produced the scopes themselves. The Americans had done what the Japanese had dismissed as impossible. They had industrialized competence. They had turned a lesson learned once into a lesson installed everywhere, simultaneously, at the speed of mass production. The Japanese could not answer this, not because their engineers lacked talent, they did not lack talent, but because the answer was not technological. The answer was systemic, and the Japanese system had been built around a philosophy that now worked against it. The very pride that had made the IJN's night combat doctrine formidable, the reverence for human mastery, the contempt for mechanical shortcuts, the belief that spirit and training could overcome material disadvantage, made it nearly impossible to absorb the lesson that Vella Gulf had delivered. Absorbing that lesson required acknowledging that the machine had equaled and then surpassed the man, and there was, within the professional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, no comfortable vocabulary for that acknowledgement. The last great surface action of the Pacific War was fought in Surigao Strait on the night of October 24, 1944. In the darkness before the American landings at Leyte Gulf, a Japanese force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers drove northward through the strait toward the Allied invasion fleet, and waiting for them tracked on radar from the moment they entered the narrowing water was an American line of battleships and cruisers whose fire control was guided almost entirely by electronic detection. The Japanese force was crossing into the barrel of a gun they could not see, aimed by eyes that cast no light. The battle was, in its geometry, a final verdict on everything that had happened. In the slot between 1942 and 1943, the radar-guided gunfire that tore through the Japanese column in the dark was the mature expression of a doctrine that had been born in failure, written in the wreckage of 4 cruisers at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound, and rewritten through every expensive lesson of the Long Solomon's campaign. By the time the sun rose over Leyte Gulf, the Japanese surface force had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting formation. There were survivors. There are always survivors. Some of them, years later, sitting across tables from American and Australian officers with notebooks and recording devices, described what it had been like, those last years of the night campaign. They described the creeping understanding that the darkness, which had belonged to Japan in the beginning, had been taken from them, not by greater courage, not by superior vision, not by the quality of any individual man, but by a machine that could see in all directions simultaneously and never needed sleep, and by a nation that had built enough of them to give one to every ship on the ocean. They described a feeling, in the later battles, of fighting an enemy who was everywhere and nowhere at once, who knew where you were without revealing where they were, who struck without warning from a darkness that seemed to belong to them just as completely as it had once belonged to Japan. What had changed was not the darkness. The darkness was what it had always been, absolute, indifferent, ancient. What had changed was the instrument brought to it, and behind the instrument, the philosophy that governed its use. Japan had built a doctrine around what a trained individual could achieve. America had built a doctrine around what a trained system could achieve. In a long war of mass, production, and industrial capacity. Exactly. The kind of war that Japanese strategic planners had known. They could not win, and had gambled, might be avoided. The system had consumed the individual, not through superior courage, but through superior replication. And in those interrogation rooms, in those quiet conversations between former enemies who had both spent years in the same black water, something was acknowledged that no official report had ever quite articulated. The SG radar had not simply been a better tool. It had been the physical embodiment of a different idea about what war was. Not a contest between the finest men each side could produce. A contest between the finest systems, a recognition that in the modern world, the advantage belonged not to the nation that could produce the single most skilled sailor, but to the nation that could place a capable sailor on every deck of every ship, simultaneously, faster than the enemy could adapt to his presence. The green glow of the PPI scope had been, in the end, the glow of that idea made real. It had lit the faces of young men in combat information centers across the Pacific Fleet. Ordinary men, many of them, men with no remarkable gift for darkness or vision, and it had made them, in aggregate, something the 15-centimeter binoculars had never been able to match. Inexhaustible. The sea remembers nothing. The water at Ironbottom Sound is the same water it was in August 1942. Warm and blue in daylight, untroubled by the steel and bone it holds at its floor. The stars still disappear when a squall moves over the Solomons, and the darkness between the islands is still the kind of darkness that swallows distance and erases direction. On certain nights, in the waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, the surface of the sea still gives back nothing. No reflection, no landmark, no horizon, just the black ocean going on. But the men who sailed those waters in the autumn of 19, who sat in darkened rooms watching a circle of green light, turn, and tell them what the night contained. Those men had learned something that the sea had tried to keep to itself for as long as ships had sailed across it. They had learned that the darkness is not an ally of any one nation. It does not choose the side with the more dedicated men, or the finer instruments, or the prouder tradition. The darkness is simply what remains when the light goes out, and what you bring to meet it is everything.